There is a man who could have recited his ideal woman without hesitating. Not described her, recited her, hair polished, voice soft, clothes elegant, manners effortless. The kind of woman who could walk beside him into a private room full of important people and immediately make sense there. He had the whole thing memorized, like a list he had been carrying in his head for years, and every time he dated, he quietly checked the boxes. Beautiful? Check. Refined? Check. Feminine in exactly the way he understood femininity? Check. And somehow, every time something was missing. Then you showed up. Sneakers, hoodie, sleeves pushed up, sitting sideways in the chair like nobody ever taught you there was a correct way to occupy space. You laughed before checking whether the joke was appropriate. You teased him when everybody else was busy agreeing with him. You reached across the table, stole one of his fries, and kept talking like you had not just violated 3 invisible rules in his carefully managed universe. And that is where this card comes in. The King of Pentacles reversed. Not as a prediction, as a mirror. Because upright, this archetype is control, structure, status, material certainty. The man who builds a world so stable that nothing gets inside unless he approves it first. Reversed, that same stability can become a cage. The standards become rigid. The preferences become rules. The life that once protected him starts deciding for him. That was his problem. He thought the checklist represented taste. It actually represented control. And you were the first woman who made him feel something he could not screen, organize, or explain away. You were not supposed to fit. That was precisely why you got through. Because while he was watching your sneakers bounce under the table, hearing you laugh too loudly, noticing how completely unimpressed you seemed by everything that usually impressed people, another realization started creeping in. The women who matched his list had made sense beside his life. You made him question the life. And that distinction scared him more than attraction ever could. Because now he was not wondering, why do I like her? He was wondering something much worse. If she is what feels real, then how much of what I thought I wanted was never mine to begin with? And what he did after that realization is where this gets interesting. So he did what people who trust control usually do when control stops working. He tightened it, not dramatically. He did not disappear. He did not suddenly become cold enough for you to notice immediately. He just became more deliberate. He watched you more carefully. The way you leaned back when you laughed. The way your sneaker hooked around the leg of the chair. The way you answered questions without first calculating what answer would make you sound impressive. Things he would once have filed under not my type. Except now he kept looking at them. That bothered him. Because attraction was supposed to confirm his standards, not argue with them. So he started mentally correcting himself. Maybe it was novelty. Maybe you were entertaining. Maybe he only liked the contrast because he had spent too much time around women who knew exactly how to behave in his world. Maybe this would wear off. There, that sounded reasonable. And reasonable was where he liked to live. But then the 5 of Swords reversed enters the picture. Again, not as fortune-telling, as psychology. Because this card can point toward the moment when winning the argument stops feeling like winning. And that was exactly what started happening inside him. He could prove you were wrong for him. He had evidence. Your hoodie would never have appeared on the checklist. Neither would the blunt jokes. Neither would the way you sat there eating fries off his plate while he was trying to tell you about something objectively impressive. A project. A deal. Some room he had recently been invited into that most people would have understood was important. He mentioned the names, the numbers, the significance. Normally, this was the part where someone's expression changed. A little more attention, a little more admiration. You just nodded. Cool. Then you pointed at his plate. You eating that, and before he could answer, another fry was gone. He stared at you. You had no idea what you had just done. That was the problem. You were not withholding admiration to manipulate him. You genuinely were not reorganizing your opinion of him around his resume. And something in him hated how much he liked that. Because every time he tried to restore the old hierarchy, you accidentally flattened it. Not by disrespecting him, by treating him normally. Like he was a man sitting across from you. Not a position, not a lifestyle, not an achievement somebody was supposed to qualify for. And suddenly his carefully memorized preferences began looking less like standards and more like defenses. He could still win the argument against you. He could list every reason you made no sense. But the Five of Swords reversed asks an uncomfortable question. What exactly do you win if winning requires you to deny what is happening right in front of you? That was when his behavior got stranger. Because instead of walking away from you, he started testing you. At first, the tests were small. A restaurant you probably would not have chosen. A conversation with people who used words like exclusive without irony. An invitation to a room where everybody seemed to know exactly which fork to pick up and exactly how much of themselves to reveal. He never called any of this a test. He probably did not even admit it to himself. But he was watching, waiting for the moment you became uncomfortable, waiting for you to look at him for instructions, waiting, maybe, for those sneakers and that easy posture to finally seem out of place. Instead, you showed up exactly as yourself, not careless, not disrespectful, just unchanged. And that is where the Five of Pentacles reverse starts making sense, not as fortune-telling, as another mirror. Because this card can speak to the fear of being outside. Outside the room, outside approval, outside whatever circle supposedly decides who belongs. And reversed, something shifts. The door matters less when you stop believing the people inside get to define your worth. That was you. You did not walk into his world trying to prove you deserved access to it. Which meant nobody in the room had much power over you. There was one man in particular who kept turning every conversation into a resume. Where he traveled, who he knew, what things cost. Everybody politely participated, including him, because he knew the rules. Then the man looked at you and made some slightly condescending comment about how casual you were, not cruel. Worse, the kind of comment disguised as sophistication. He tensed before you did. You just looked at the man for a second, then smiled. You seem really worried about my hoodie. That was it. No speech, no anger. You went back to what you were eating. And somehow the entire performance collapsed. Even the man laughed. He watched you handle in 8 seconds what he would have spent 15 minutes strategically navigating. That confused him, because according to the checklist, you lacked polish. But what he was actually watching was composure. You lacked refinement as he had defined it, but you had social intelligence. You were not trying to dominate the room. You were simply not afraid of it. And slowly, something uncomfortable became obvious. Maybe he had mistaken knowing the rules for confidence. Maybe he had mistaken fitting in for belonging. Because while you sat there, slightly underdressed and completely relaxed, he became aware of how much of his own behavior changed depending on who was watching. His laugh, his vocabulary, even the way he held his shoulders. You were supposed to be the one struggling to fit into his world. Instead, he was suddenly noticing how hard he worked to fit into it himself. Of course, he resisted that conclusion. He told himself you were just unusually adaptable. That was easier. But then something happened he could not explain away. Other people started watching the two of you. And they noticed something between you before he was ready to admit there was anything there at all. It started with a look. Not from you. From somebody watching him watch you. You were across the room talking, one hand shoved into your hoodie pocket, laughing at something that apparently did not deserve the amount of laughter you were giving it. And he was looking over again. A friend caught him. You like her. He looked away immediately. No, too fast. That was mistake number 1, because people who genuinely do not care usually do not sound like they are answering an accusation. His friend smiled. He ignored it. Then came the evidence. You know you actually listen when she talks, right? That irritated him. I listen to everybody. No, you wait for everybody else to finish. He had no answer for that. Because it was true. With most people. He was already preparing the response. With you, he wanted to know what ridiculous thing you were going to say next. He remembered that you hated pickles. He noticed when you got quiet. In crowded rooms, he somehow kept ending up beside you without remembering making the decision to move. And when you teased him, he let you. That might have been the most suspicious part, because this was a man who noticed disrespect quickly. But you could look directly at him after one of his overly serious explanations and say, "Okay, Professor." And he would try not to smile. Try. That is where justice reversed enters. Not as a verdict, as a mirror, because justice is supposed to be about clean conclusions. This belongs here. That belongs there. This behavior means this. This person fits that category. Reversed, the scales stop cooperating. The evidence starts contradicting the judgment you already decided to make, and his judgment had been decided years ago. Women like you were not his type. Case closed. Except everybody around him was looking at the evidence and reaching a completely different conclusion. That embarrassed him more than he expected. Not because liking you was embarrassing, because people knew what he usually chose. They knew the polished women, the elegant women, the women who looked beside him exactly the way everyone expected. His taste had become part of the brand, and now there you were. Sneakers, blunt jokes. Zero interest in helping him maintain the brand. And somehow he looked more like himself beside you than he ever had beside women who matched it. That was the part he could not defend against. Because maybe some of those old relationships had done more than provide companionship. Maybe they had confirmed something. Successful man, appropriate woman, appropriate life, everything visually correct. You did not confirm the image. You interrupted his awareness of it. Around you, sometimes he forgot to manage himself, and now other people could see that happening. So when somebody joked again, "You two are obvious," he laughed, dismissed it, changed the subject, then almost immediately became more careful around you. A little less available, a little less warm, because once he realized the feeling was visible, he did what controlled people often do when something private escapes containment. He pulled back. At first, you almost wondered if you had imagined the whole thing. The attention, the looks, the way he always seemed to find a reason to keep the conversation going. Because suddenly his messages got shorter. He stopped lingering. If you made one of those comments that used to pull a real laugh out of him, you got the controlled version instead. A smile. Polite, measured, safe, and that was almost worse. Because you could feel the difference. But you did not chase it. You did not ask 3 times if something was wrong. You did not start rearranging yourself to get the warmer version of him back. You noticed. Then you kept moving. That is where the 7 of Swords reversed comes in. Not as deception, as exposure. Because sometimes the hardest thing to hide is not what you are doing. It is why you are doing it. He told himself he was creating distance because distance was sensible. Because this had gotten too visible, too complicated, too far outside the plan. But underneath that explanation was something much less flattering. He was trying to escape the evidence. If he stopped standing near you, maybe he would stop noticing how easy it felt. If he stopped texting, maybe he would stop checking his phone for your name. If he made the connection more formal, maybe it would become formal. That was the strategy. Except you refused to cooperate with it, not intentionally. You simply kept being yourself. You talked to other people. You laughed. You wore the same sneakers. You moved through the room without scanning for his approval, and that unsettled him in a completely different way, because somewhere in his history, attention had probably functioned like proof. If someone wanted him, they moved toward him. They made it obvious. They adjusted. You did not. So now pulling away did not restore control. It only removed the part of his day he had quietly started looking forward to. That was the detail he had not calculated. Control sometimes feels powerful because the disappointment is predictable. You know what happens next. You choose the distance. You choose the outcome. Nothing surprises you. But wanting you meant accepting something he could not guarantee. And that was what the King of Pentacles reversed had been pointing toward all along. You were not frightening because you were unstable. You were frightening because the old structure had no instructions for you. No box, no script, no safe category. His retreat probably would have worked anyway. He was disciplined enough for that. Except one ordinary day, something happened. Nothing romantic, nothing dramatic. He reached for his phone to tell you something stupid that had just happened, and stopped. Because for the first time, he realized you had already become the person his mind went looking for before he gave it permission. And once he noticed that, he started seeing you everywhere, not literally. In stupid little moments. Someone said something at work that was so confidently wrong he almost reached for his phone. Because he already knew what you would say. Probably something inappropriate. Probably something that would make him laugh while pretending not to. Then he saw a pair of sneakers in a store window. Not even your exact pair, close enough. His eyes stayed there a second longer than they needed to. Later, he ordered food and moved the fries slightly farther from the edge of the table without thinking, then caught himself. That one annoyed him, because you were not even there to steal them. And somehow he had already made room for you anyway. That is where the Ten of Pentacles becomes interesting. Not as a promise of some perfect future, as a question about what makes a life actually feel full. Because his life already had most of the visible pieces. Structure, comfort, recognition, people who knew his name, rooms he had worked hard to enter, everything in place. Nothing was falling apart. That was exactly what made the problem harder to explain. His life was fine. It just felt quieter now. He would sit through conversations with people who agreed with him beautifully and suddenly miss being interrupted. He would say something serious and wait, almost unconsciously, for you to make fun of the way he said it. Nobody did. They nodded, respectfully, and for the first time, respect started feeling a little lonely. That surprised him. Because he had assumed what he liked about you was the attraction, your face, your energy. The tomboy thing that made no sense beside the old checklist. But that was not what he missed most. He missed himself. The version of himself that showed up around you. Less polished, less careful. The man who would argue with you over something completely stupid and forget to check whether he sounded impressive. The man who laughed with his whole face. The man who could sit beside someone in a hoodie and stop thinking about what the room thought of him. That was the real disruption. Your tomboy swag was never powerful because it was the opposite of femininity. It was powerful because you were not performing. And somehow, standing beside someone who was not performing made his own performance harder to ignore. You had not destabilized his life. You had shown him the difference between a life that was secure and a life that was alive. The Ten of Pentacles could hold everything he thought he wanted. The right home, the right reputation, the right woman standing in the right place. But now another question had entered the room. One he could not put back outside. He had spent all this time asking whether you fit his life. Now he was asking something completely different. Why does my life feel more like mine when she is in it? And that question led directly to the truth he had been avoiding. And that truth was uncomfortable, because the checklist had never been entirely his. Not really. Some of it probably started before he was old enough to call it preference. The women his family approved of. The women other successful men seemed proud to stand beside. The kind of femininity that received compliments without creating questions. Elegant, composed, easy to introduce, safe. Then ambition added its own requirements. If he was going to become this kind of man, surely a certain kind of woman belonged beside him. So the checklist grew, quietly, one expectation at a time, until inherited rules started sounding exactly like personal taste. And that is where the Chariot reversed enters. Not as failure, as direction. Because the Chariot upright knows where it is going, forward. Controlled, reins in hand, destination chosen. Reversed, the uncomfortable possibility appears that you can move very efficiently in a direction you never actually chose. That was him. He had become excellent at building the life he was supposed to want. Excellent. And then you walked into it wearing sneakers. That sounds almost ridiculous. Except the sneakers were never really the point. Neither was the hoodie. Neither was the way you sat sideways, or laughed without lowering the volume first. What bothered him was the permission underneath all of it. You seemed to belong to yourself. You did not check the room before deciding who to be. You did not soften every opinion into something easier to approve. You were capable of adjusting when respect required it. You just did not confuse adjustment with surrender. And suddenly he had to confront something he had never expected to feel toward you. Envy, not of your life, of your freedom inside it. Because you broke rules he had followed for so long that he no longer remembered anybody teaching them to him. Stand like this, speak like this, want this. Choose someone who confirms this. Do not make the people who believed in your direction wonder whether you were ever going the right way. That last one mattered. Because changing his mind about his type sounded simple until he imagined the reactions. The questions. She's really different from who you usually date. The raised eyebrow, the polite surprise. Maybe even his own discomfort hearing himself explain why none of that mattered anymore. And suddenly the reversed king looked different too. The castle was still impressive, but now he could see the locked doors. Doors he had locked himself. So no, this was no longer just about whether he wanted you. Attraction was becoming the easiest part. The harder question was whether he wanted you enough to disappoint the version of himself everyone had already learned to expect. And eventually, that question stopped being theoretical. Because somebody said it out loud. Not cruelly. That would have been easier. It came dressed as a joke. You were standing a few feet away, talking to someone. Sleeves pushed up again, completely unaware that your existence had apparently become a topic. A man beside him glanced over, then smiled. She is definitely not your usual type. There it was, simple, accurate, and loaded with everything nobody needed to explain. He felt the old reflex immediately. Laugh, shrug, say something neutral. Something like, yeah, she's different. Keep the room comfortable. Keep himself uncommitted. That was what the old version of him knew how to do. And that is where the Wheel of Fortune reversed enters. Not as bad luck, as repetition. 'Cause sometimes the wheel keeps bringing you back to the same choice until you finally respond differently. Protect the image. Or protect what you know. For a second, he could feel both versions of himself standing there. The man who had spent years making sure his life looked intentional. And the man who had recently caught himself moving fries away from the edge of a table because you were not there. The friend added something else. Can you even picture her at one of those formal things you go to? A small laugh, the kind he once might have joined. Except now he pictured you there immediately, not transformed, not suddenly wearing someone else's personality. You, probably making fun of the appetizers. Probably noticing which person in the room felt left out before anyone else did. Probably making him forget to check whether he was standing correctly. He looked over at you, You caught him looking. Raised your eyebrows. What? He almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned back. She'd be fine, that was all. No speech. No dramatic defense. Just certainty. The other man shrugged. Conversation moved on. But something had changed. Because for once, he had not protected the version of himself everybody recognized. He had protected the truth. Not your worth. You had never needed him to prove that. His own recognition of you. That was different. And strangely, it felt more stable than all the careful neutrality he had been using before. Maybe that was the real shift in the reversed king. Security was no longer making sure nothing unexpected entered the castle. Maybe security was knowing you could open the door without disappearing. But choosing you still meant choosing uncertainty. He had no checklist for what happened next. No approved sequence. No guarantee that wanting you would leave him recognizable to himself. And that was exactly what frightened him. The real breakthrough did not happen in that room. It happened later, when there was nobody left to impress. Nobody left to disappoint. Just you. And the truth he had finally run out of ways to avoid. And when it finally came out, it was not polished. That mattered. Because this was a man who usually knew how to make a sentence behave before he let anyone hear it. But not this one. You were sitting across from him again. Not in some important room. No audience. No one to impress. Your body turned slightly sideways in the chair like always. One sneaker moving under the table. And he kept looking at it, then at you, then away. You know you're not what I thought I wanted. There it was. Not exactly romantic. You raised an eyebrow. Wow. Thanks, he almost laughed. Almost. But he did not retreat this time. I don't mean it like that. You waited. And that is where the King of Swords reversed enters. Not as cruelty. As the moment intellect stops being able to protect you from what you already know. Because this archetype can become trapped inside its own explanations. Analyze enough. Define enough. Find the correct argument. And maybe feeling will finally obey. His never did. He looked down. I thought the casual thing would bother me. Your hoodie, your sneakers. The way you could sit in an expensive place and somehow make it feel like somebody's kitchen. It doesn't. A pause. Actually, I think I'm calmer around you. That admission seemed to annoy him slightly, which made it more believable. Then came the harder one. I thought the way you mess with me was disrespectful. You smiled. Sometimes it is. That got him. A real laugh. Brief, unmanaged. Then his face changed again. But you don't treat me like everybody else does. That was the sentence. The one underneath all the others. He had spent years being respected for what he built. Listened to because of what he knew. Wanted, sometimes, because of what being beside him represented. You stole his fries. Called him Professor. Watched him explain something far too seriously and interrupted with, "Are you done?" And somehow none of it made him feel smaller. It made him feel visible. Just him. Not the position. Not the resume. Not the man other people had already decided he was. He took a breath. I kept thinking you were the exception. You did not say anything. But I don't think that's it. Now he looked directly at you. I think the rule was wrong. And that was the part that scared him. Because wanting you was manageable. Wanting you could still be called chemistry. But admitting the rule was wrong meant looking back at every standard he had defended and asking who it had actually been protecting. He had not been afraid that you would fail to fit his life. He had been afraid that you would fit so naturally he would have to become more honest inside it. And now that truth was finally sitting between you. No checklist could solve it. Which meant the most important question was no longer whether he could throw the old list away. It was what he was going to use instead. What replaced it was much less efficient. Attention. Not categories, not requirements, attention. How did he feel when he was actually with someone? Could he speak without editing every sentence first? Could he disagree without turning the conversation into a contest? Could he admire someone without needing them to admire him in exactly the right way? Could he relax? That last one turned out to matter more than he expected, and that is where the Queen of Pentacles enters. Not as the woman he was supposed to choose, as a completely different definition of security. Because this archetype is grounded without being rigid, comfortable without needing everything to look perfect, present, real. The kind of stability that does not come from controlling the room. It comes from being at home inside yourself. And suddenly he understood something about you that the old checklist had never been sophisticated enough to measure. You were grounded, just not polished in the way he had been trained to recognize grounding. Your hoodie did not mean you lacked standards. Your sneakers did not mean you lacked presence. Your teasing did not mean you lacked respect. And stealing one of his fries certainly did not mean you lacked manners. Well, maybe that one was debatable. But none of those things were the real story. The real story was that you never seemed to audition. You did not walk into his life asking, "What role do I need to play so you will choose me?" You just arrived, sat sideways, pushed up your sleeves, laughed when something was funny, disagreed when you disagreed. And somehow, that simple refusal to perform forced him to notice how much performing he had mistaken for compatibility. That did not mean his preferences disappeared. It did not mean every standard was fake. And it definitely did not mean every man secretly wants a tomboy. That would just be another checklist. The difference was that he stopped asking whether someone matched the picture before asking whether the connection was real. That was the shift. The King of Pentacles reversed had shown him what happens when security becomes control. The Queen of Pentacles showed the alternative. Security that can breathe. Security that does not panic when something unexpected feels right. Security strong enough to be changed without calling the change a threat. And somewhere along the way, the old list became harder for him to remember. Funny, he used to know it by heart. Hair, voice, clothes, manners. He could have recited every detail. Now, sitting across from you, watching that sneaker bounce under the table again, the categories felt strangely far away. Not because you finally fit the checklist, because he finally stopped needing you to. And maybe that was what shattered his world. Not your tomboy swag. Not really. It was the fact that you walked into a life built around being certain, and made being real feel safer.